The Roaring Twenties, a time of abundant wealth and glamour, but underneath the gilded surface laid a dark uncertainty which was about to cripple the nation's economy. As America was being devastated by tragic economic disasters of the 1920s and 1930s, the country was plummeting into the Great Depression. In the midst of this tragedy, the New Deal programs were implemented by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt to bring the American people to prosperity. These programs were defined in large part by new regulations on banking and finances. These changes were radical and controversial at the time, but were vital to organizing an economy that was in less danger of another economic crisis. Many of these regulations have been removed over time, and the economic situation of the country today, in many respects, is similar to how it was before the Great Depression. But there is no doubt that these reforms have had a massive triumphant impact on the modern world, both because of the lasting systems that it established and because it forever altered the expectation of the government's role in the economy. During the 1920s, the American stock market was booming with little to no government interference. An increase in industrialization and urbanization meant more expansions of big business and more people living in cities. These trends contributed to a general perception of the economy as strong, prosperous, and stable, which led to many Americans desiring to invest in the stock market for the first time. A large problem that depositors faced was the lack of legal separation between commercial and investment banks, meaning that banks could use depositors' money to make high-risk bets on the market, which made the repercussions all the more devastating when it collapsed. This crash was made inevitable by the very fragile state of the American economy. It was certainly growing, but the unprecedented levels of investing confidence that came with unprecedented levels of change in the country's structure inflated the value of the stock market far past what was actually merited by the amount of growth. This means that the growth was largely artificial, based on speculation and little more than a pretense with nothing concrete to fall back on. The American economy was even described by British politician Philip Snowden as a perfect orgy of speculation. In short, it was due for a massive correction, and when this happened, everyone was affected. The Dow fell 25% over the first 2 days of the crash. Many banks and individuals who invested in the stock market lost all of their money, and many of those people got their money via bank loans. Since people couldn't pay back their loans to the suffering banks, bankruptcy occurred amongst both the banks and the people. In addition, the decentralized, disorganized nature of the Federal Reserve System, along with the restraint of maintaining the gold standard, led to its refusal to give out loans or to lower interest rates to stimulate recovery. The effects of the Depression were felt in every crevice of American finance. From 1929 to 1933, stock prices were cut by 1/5, and almost 10,000 bank suspensions occurred, which is when banks stop allowing people to convert their deposits into cash, usually in response to mass withdrawal or bank runs. The tangible manifestation of the Great Depression, catalyzed by the stock market crash, was the daily sight of crowds filled with starving people waiting for food in breadlines and soup kitchens. During his presidency, Herbert Hoover did very little in face of the Great Depression. All of the rapidly worsening effects of the Great Depression led the American people to call for drastic action via the election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. At the time, he was the governor of New York and an outspoken advocate for drastic government action to alleviate the effects of the Great Depression. The popular desire for this action was so potent that some even advocated for giving Roosevelt dictatorial powers as president, and while this was not the result, he beat incumbent President Hoover in an electoral college landslide with 42 out of 48 states, and was sworn in as the 32nd president on March 4, 1933.
When Roosevelt was inaugurated, the country was in such dire straits that it was very close to a revolution or another civil war. And many people forget that it was really teetering on the edge.
President Roosevelt immediately reversed Hoover's economic disposition upon taking office in 1933 via a rapid succession of new policies. According to President Hoover, our banking system was the weakest link in our whole economic system, the worst part of the dismal tragedy with which I had to deal. Roosevelt likely agreed with this particular sentiment, as he declared a national bank holiday, freezing operation of all banks in the country 2 days after becoming president, and during that holiday, signed the Emergency Banking Act of 1933. This act had examiners verify that banks were secure, and had the Federal Reserve banks give loans to struggling banks.
They began giving people confidence, for example, in the banking system, which they had lost.
I can assure you, my friends, that it is safer to keep your money in a reopened bank than it is to keep it under the mattress.
A subsequent piece of banking legislation passed as part of the New Deal was the Banking Act of 1933, commonly known as the Glass-Steagall Act, after its sponsors Senator Carter Glass and Representative Henry B. Steagall. One of the main features of this act was the creation of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation.
Basically, what would happen is that people would get scared, right? A bank would be about to fail. Then what would happen would be called a bank run. Everyone would flock to the bank trying to get their money out, because if the bank failed, they might lose their life savings. Because they didn't have what we take for granted today, which is FDIC. So if you put money into a bank, it's insured for up to $250,000.
In fact, the FDIC has been functioning effectively since 1934, and as of the second fiscal quarter of 2018, the FDIC partially insured deposits to 5,542 institutions. It had many other provisions, but one of the most significant of these is one that outlawed the combination of commercial and investment banks. Additionally, the gold standard was partially eliminated by the Gold Reserve Act of 1934, with which the government ordered all banks to turn over their gold backups to the Treasury. This freed up banks to give out loans to stimulate business without having to charge high interest rates to maintain the gold standard. This led to the recovery of many businesses, and it allows the economy to flourish in this way in modern society. It also provided the government with a significant amount of new revenue with which they could take action against the crisis. Overall, the role of the government in the stock market and banking transformed dramatically, and this led to what is perhaps the most significant legacy of the New Deal.
The New Deal fundamentally changed the role of the federal government in the economy. And today you're seeing that being sort of pulled back.
This really began in earnest under President Reagan. So the whole idea is to undo every last vestige of the New Deal.
One notable example of this was the 1999 repeal of two provisions of Glass-Steagall, which prevented the combination of commercial and investment banks. The federal government also forced states to relax their regulations on predatory lending, which is when a lender gives loans with full knowledge that they are unfair and will exploit the borrower. There was also a lack of regulation around securitization of mortgages, which allowed people to combine multiple subprime mortgages into a security and sell them as less risky than they actually were. These securities were very easily pushed upon people by predatory lenders, who knew how risky they were. The resulting explosion of people with mortgages created a spike in housing prices and a bubble in the housing market. This bubble popped when many people defaulted on their subprime mortgages and were unable to pay back the loans they took out to finance them. This caused a chain of bank failures, starting with Lehman Brothers in 2008. The fact that the Glass-Steagall repeal made the banks bigger and made their vast investments rely on deposits, aka too big to fail, contributed to the scope of the resulting crisis. The resulting Great Recession was similar to the Great Depression in that many people were negatively affected, but was different in the actions taken after. The only comparable government action to the New Deal passed in the wake of the Great Recession was the 2010 Dodd-Frank Act, which created oversight of banks, and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which limited predatory lending. However, this act has already started to be rolled back, and many people say that these reforms did not go far enough, leaving open the possibility of another devastating economic disaster in the not-too-distant future. In the context of all of American history, the Great Depression serves not only as a sobering reminder of our vulnerability, but also as the dividing line between two eras of our government's role in the economy. Although the collapse of the financial world caused immense struggles, this tragedy directly led to the triumphant creation of regulations which continue to positively impact Americans to this day. This would not be the case without the Great Depression, which, despite its cataclysmic effects, is nevertheless responsible for many powerfully positive forces in modern society. It is important, however, to not just focus on the positive economic effects of these programs, but also on the lasting legacy of its unsolved problems and the question of the government's economic responsibilities that will continue to torment economists and historians forever. The triumphant achievements of New Deal regulations have been subsequently chipped away at, and America has reached a point where it needs to make a choice. Should we continue on a path towards a pre-Depression financial system, or do we bring back the legacy of the New Deal to create a more secure economy for all Americans?